Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In the last episode, we found out what George, John, and Ringo were thinking when they did an interview with Maureen Cleave. She also used her insight to determine how they really were by what they were interested in and what they had in their houses. Now we will come to Paul and then on to other things as well. During February, Paul was exploring music and he was adding finishing touches on a 40,000-pound house he bought the previous April. The house must have needed a lot of work. The house was on Cavendish Avenue, St. John's Wood, and it was close to EMI Studios. It's a 3-story townhome that was to be his permanent home in London. The group would meet at his house because it was so close to the studio. Moving there gave Paul space and freedom. He had access to the clubs, cinemas, art galleries, theaters, and performance spaces of central London. The house had the latest in ovens and rotisseries, the best sound system for his record players, and a movie screen in the dining room. He had John Dunbar's designer sister Marina and her architect husband John Adams to redesign the interior of the property. Pete Simpson was hired to paint decorative scenes on the cupboard doors in his music room. From an architect's point of view, Paul had basic demands. He wanted the renovation to be done as quickly as possible with a 6,000-pound budget. Paul liked hominess over modern look, and he asked Adams to design the ground floor in a way that the kitchen smells would waft up into the living room, as it did at the Asher home. He got his furniture from auction rooms on Old Brompton Road. He got a mahogany table for £10, and Paul said he didn't go for the modern stuff. He liked to be comfortable. In the basement, there was an apartment for the Kellys who cooked and looked after the house. Paul collected art, and he bought a 4-square-foot oil painting by pop artist Peter Blake. He got a metal sculpture titled Solo, made by the Scottish artist Edoardo Palozzi, and it was in the music room. Paul did an interview with the radio disc jockey Alan Freeman, and Paul said he wanted to read more than he had been doing. He said millions of books came out last year, and I only read 20 of them. It's a drag. I think that's pretty good. He mentioned he wanted the Beatles to move forward rather than tread water. He mentioned reading plays, investigating reports of the Kennedy assassination, learning to read music, making home movies, and listening to classical music. Paul said he made himself listen to classical records, though nobody in his house ever liked them. He said he didn't care for a lot of them. It was too fruity and sentimental. And he also listened to modern compositions. His plan for the Beatles in 1966 was to push forward, break new artistic ground. Paul had an early Philips cassette tape player and had it installed in his car. British cars back then only had radios, if they had a sound system at all. The Beatles saw all the entries in the Billboard singles charts. That way they could see what everyone wanted to listen to. There was The Lightning Strikes by Lou Christie, Working My Way Back to You by the Four Seasons, I Fought the Law by the Bobby Fuller Four, etc. Paul was also reading avant-garde literary magazines, Evergreen Review, and Big Table. In 1965, the Beatles publisher Dick James had given John and Paul Brunel Mark V reel-to-reel tape recorders. This was so they could work on their songwriting at home. Then they could bring their works into the studio at the start of the recording sessions. They could take more risk away from George Martin. George said if you write a song on tape, you have a much better idea in your head of how it sounds, and you could take it from there. And there was another recording equipment that was left at Ringo's vacated London flat at 34 Montague Square. Paul used it to work on new songs. Using 2 machines, he could record himself singing with an acoustic guitar, then play it back while playing along on the bass or electric piano, everything being recorded on the second machine. Well, John, he felt like he was cut off living in Weybridge. He said he was dying to move into town. John said, I'm waiting to see how Paul gets on when he gets into his townhouse. If he gets by all right, then I'll sell the place at Weybridge, probably to some American who'll pay a fortune for it. I suppose I could have a flat in town, but I don't want to spend another £20,000 to have somewhere to stay overnight when I've had too much bevy to drive home. Now we get to the Cleaves interview with Paul. When she saw him, she thought he was tall, agile, neatly dressed, and well organized. His hair was the right length, and he was never at a loss for words. He liked to tease and was a good mimic. He had charm, wit, a critical intelligence, and an enormous talent. She also felt he was self-conscious, nervy, restless, and always on the go. Paul was telling Maureen the things that he had told Alan Freeman. Paul and his music lessons, his love of drama, and wanting to be self-educated. Paul had national pride. He valued Britain's theatrical heritage and its standard of broadcasting. He liked the British for their preservation, everything from buildings and ancient customs to traditional beer brewing methods and endangered species. He told Cleave that he was about to drive down to Weybridge to write with John, the first session in a long time, and he showed her the lyrics to Eleanor Rigby. The Beatles became friends with photographer Robert Whittaker. He was British-born but transplanted to Australia at the age of 20. And he was the one that came up with their controversial cover of the Beatles in lab coats and baby parts and meat. He wanted to demythalize the Beatles, and he got the inspiration from Hans Bellmer, a German artist. He made life-size dolls during the 1930s and photographed them in different stages of dismemberment. His reason was for illustrating the destruction of innocence. Whittaker had a reason at different times for why he did that cover. One being that the plastic limbs and raw meat were what the Beatles would be if the fans broke through security and got hold of them with their bare hands. Other times he said that the props were reminders that John, Paul, George, and Ringo weren't gods to be worshipped, but creatures of flesh and blood. The Beatles never asked Whittaker what his motive was. They just liked that they were doing something un-Beatle-like. Paul thought it was a protest about Vietnam, and John was hoping that it would relieve them of their happy-go-lucky boys from Liverpool. A journalist asked the Beatles what the inspiration was behind the picture, and John said it was inspired by our boredom and resentment at having to do another photo session and another Beatle thing. That combination produced the cover. Brian Epstein flew to Memphis at the request of the Beatles to investigate the possibility of the group recording in the city. They liked the stack sound that they had performers such as Wilson Pickett, Eddie Floyd, Otis Redding, and Booker T and the MGs. The Rolling Stones had recorded in America in 1965, and the result was I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Mick kept urging Paul to get the Beatles to cross the Atlantic to make a record. He said the session musicians were cooler and the ambiance funkier. The Beatles didn't record in America because Paul said that Stax wanted to charge them too much. When they finished Revolver, they realized they found a new British sound almost by accident. In 1987, George Martin was interviewed, and he said that there were problems with the Beatles recording in America, and George Martin didn't want to record there. EMI pointed out that it wouldn't have made sense because every record would have had to bear 1.5% AFM, American Federation of Musicians, levy. It wasn't feasible. He said he had to do what EMI told him to do. When the Beatles became rich, they resented the huge sums they had to pay in taxes. Harold Wilson was the prime minister, and the Beatles and him would seem to be a good fit because he was for the working class people, and he had a tolerance for the young people. The Beatles, though, resented the super tax Wilson had come up with. It had 96.25% for high earners. For every £1 million the Beatles earned, they were only allowed to keep less than $50,000. This made George really mad. He was the most concerned with finances, and he was the most anti-war. It made him mad that his earnings would finance fighter planes and bombers. April 6th, the Beatles got together at EMI Studios on Abbey Road with George Martin and balance engineer Jeff Emmerich and technical engineer Phil McDonnell. The Beatles were in the right place because technically it provided them with the best available equipment, along with a team of site experts who knew everything about sound recording. The Beatles had a third of their songs for the album in rough form when they returned to the studio after their winter break. Paul and John finished Eleanor Rigby. Paul had written For No One and Got to Get You Into My Life, and George had written Love You Too. On Wednesday night, John had sketched out a song that would evoke the experience of an LSD trip, and it drew indirectly on the text of the Tibetan Buddhism. They put in random tape recordings played backward and distorted the vocal to sound like the chanting of an Eastern monk. The new song was initially called Mark I, and then became The Void, before naming it Tomorrow Never Knows. This phrase came from Ringo. The Beatles were interviewed on the BBC TV on their return from London Airport. Ringo was asked about what happened to him at the British Embassy reception in Washington. That was when somebody snipped a lock of his hair as a souvenir. The interviewer asked, "What happened exactly?" And Ringo said, "I don't know. I was just doing an interview like I am now. I was talking away, and there it goes. I looked around, and there were 400 people smiling, and you can't blame anyone. I mean, what can you say?" John chimed in, "Well, what can you say?" And Ringo answered, "Tomorrow never knows." And John, who was standing behind him, started laughing. John remembered what Ringo said and thought the title would counteract the heavy philosophical lyrics. John had gone to a bookstore and he came across The Psychedelic Experience, written in 1964 by Timothy Leary and two fellow academic psychologists, Richard Albert and Ralph Metzner. So John sat down on a sofa in the middle of the shop floor and looked through the book. Leary did some psychedelic drugs in 1960 while he was a lecturer in clinical psychology at Harvard. He advocated the drugs for their potential for personal transformation. Leary, more than anyone else, made comparisons between his LSD experience and the feelings of transcendence recorded by devotees of Hinduism and Buddhism through techniques such as fasting, sensory deprivation, and meditation. John started taking LSD regularly after the drug was slipped into his coffee by George and Patty's private dentist, John Riley, at a dinner party in April 1965. The experience initially terrified John because he wasn't given preparation or guidance. John was in an elevator on his way up to the Ad Lib nightclub near Leicester Square and thought that the building was on fire at that moment. Leary said that John should have been surrounded by nurturing sounds and familiar objects. Cynthia told the author in 2005, "We didn't know the effect it was going to have on us. It was like sitting in this room and it suddenly became like the Albert Hall. Patty and George were opposite, and John was beside me, and they started disappearing in the distance. I wondered what on earth was happening. We just had to get out." And Patty Boyd remembered, "I didn't know what was happening to me. It was more frightening than anything I'd ever experienced. I thought I would be like this for the rest of my life." John Riley said that we shouldn't leave the house because he had given us LSD, but we thought, so? What's that? It was a totally irresponsible thing to have done. So John tripped another time at a rented house in the Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles, in August 1965, during the Beatles' U.S. tour. He was in the company of George, Ringo, and the Byrds, David Crosby, and Roger McGuinn. Peter Fonda and Don Short were there, too. By 1966, John was doing his tripping at home. John was inactive while he was in the home, and the drug filled his mind with powerful impressions without him having to leave the house. John played his song to Paul and George Martin, and they were both surprised that the song only used one chord, and the lyrics were philosophical, unlike anything the Beatles had done before. Paul said for a while that he wanted fewer chords, but he was thinking of Little Richard, not the drone of a tambura. So Paul remembered that George Martin wasn't fazed by the different-sounding song. He nodded his head and said, "Very interesting, John. Very interesting." John got the sound he wanted for his voice by passing his voice through a Leslie speaker. And then Paul had his song, "Gotta Get You Into My Life," a love song for LSD. I always thought it was for marijuana. But John's song was intended to evoke the experience itself. Paul, on the other hand, chose an upbeat approach influenced by the pop singles being produced by Motown, Stax, and Atlantic. He wrote a love song for the drug just as Shelley and Pablo Neruda had written love poems to wine. They started at 8:15 p.m. and they worked for 5¼ hours on the song. They did 5 takes before deciding the last take was the best. So Gotta Get You Into My Life celebrated another kind of mind. After being off for the weekend, the Beatles returned to work, and they got to work on George's first song for the LP, "Love You Too," and it was called Granny Smith before George got a title for it. George had played the sitar for John's song Norwegian Wood in 1965, and he was just learning how to play the sitar then. Then he started to practice daily, and "Love You Too" was the first song he composed on the sitar. George had written the song when Maureen interviewed him, and she said he wishes he could write fine songs as Lennon and McCartney do, but he has difficulty with the words. "Patty keeps asking me to write more beautiful words." Then the newest song had a lyric, "Love me while you can, before I'm a dead old man." So George knew these words weren't beautiful, and George Martin found a player named Anil Bhagwat to play a tabla. When Bagwat got to the studio, Paul and Ringo were playing chess, and John was away somewhere, and George welcomed him. He offered him a drink and spoke with him about a track, and he wanted his help to work on it. George and Paul had made a basic version of the song with George's voice and guitar along with backing vocals. George said he wanted the song to sound like Ravi Shankar and his tabla player, Ali Raka, and what they had achieved on an album track. And Bagwat said he knew that piece was 16 beats, and George said, "That's what I'd like you to play, please." They sat on the studio floor facing each other, and Jeff Emmerich placed high-performance ribbon mics close to George's sitar and Bagwat's tabla to give it an in-your-face sound. They both listened to the basic track on their headphones and then played along to it. Bagwat said that on the internet it was said that George wasn't playing the sitar, and Bagwat said it was 100% that George was playing. It was just George and him playing the song, and the song was rehearsed a dozen times before they were ready to do a take. When the session was over, a car picked up Bagwat and dropped him off at his apartment in Earl's Court. He would be mentioned on the back cover of Revolver. So I'm going to stop the video here. In this episode, we find out a lot of what Paul was up to in that year, getting his house completed, and he had his interview with Maureen Cleave, and we found out how some of the Beatles got involved with LSD in the first place. Then we got the backstory on a couple of songs that were on the Revolver album. Eleanor Rigby, Tomorrow Never Knows, Got to Get You Into My Life, and Love You Too. So it was neat finding out how the songs were created and how different the songs were from what they had recorded before. They were going forward as they all wanted to, not living in the past, but getting more and more creative. I'm anxious to find out more from the book, and it's neat to have a magnifying glass on that year in their lives. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you.